Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are going to do my May end of month wrap up. We're going to talk about all the books I read or attempted to read in the last 2 weeks of May. And we are going to start with You Had Me at Hola by Alexis Daria. So this is an adult contemporary romance, and we're following our two leads who happen to be the stars of a telenovela. And both of them have a lot riding on this particular series being very successful. And unfortunately, some stuff happens that kind of messes with the chemistry, and it shows in how the characters, like their characters, interact on set. And so they decide to go ahead and practice their lines in private, which everything kind of goes from there. So I really like this. This is definitely more of a serious romance rather than like a super fluffy romance. It deals with some very serious things. Both of our characters, Ashton and Jasmine, have their own issues, and we do actually talk about it. I sometimes I do think the writing about those issues did get a little clunky, and sometimes it was weird because it was like almost a little in your face, and sometimes it was almost playing coy. So like all of Jasmine's issues are a little bit in your face, all of Ashton's are a little bit more coy, to the point where I read some reviews where people were like, I don't understand this, or like he's overreacting. So I think that they didn't quite get it, and I think that that is a little bit down to how it was written. But if you're more aware of mental health, I think it'll be a little bit more easy to pick up on Ashton's issues. But at the end, I do appreciate that with those issues, it is in the epilogue, it is mentioned specifically that they're both in therapy, which is like, I don't know. I really, really appreciated that particular thing. I really liked how the telenovela filming was incorporated into the text. They actually have like short chapters where we're watching Jasmine and Ashton like really inhabit their characters and act out the scenes, and you can tell later that that's like more of a stand-in for their feelings and all of that kind of stuff. But I do think it was a really effective way to kind of tell the story that is going on in the telenovela and relating it to what Ashton and Jasmine are trying to work through as well. There is also a decent chunk of Spanish. Most of it you can pick up through context clues. However, if you really want to know absolutely everything that's being said, you might want to have a translator at the ready if you are unfamiliar with Spanish. Just be aware some of it is cuss words. So heads up. I think as far as the, steamy versus sweet, it definitely is more on the steamy side. The main characters do not jump into bed until about halfway through, which is very appropriate for the story that's being told. But it is pretty steamy sex, and like it's not super vanilla, but it's not super kinky either. It's just kind of it's just kind of steamy. Like, I guess is the rest. I mean, that's really the best way to explain it. But I do think that the author did a really great job balancing out the sex and the storyline in the second half of the book, which I really do appreciate, because I have read a number of books recently, contemporary romances, where once sex enters the picture, that's all that it's about, which I just do not appreciate. So I do think that the author did a good job of that. However, my biggest issue with this happened with the big blowout fight that Jasmine and Ashton had, which is, pretty typical for a romance. But basically, they had the fight, and then Jasmine walked away, and she's like, I am so mean. I was so mean to him. I was like, girl, you were not mean. You were telling him the truth. You didn't pull your punches, and maybe you could have been more diplomatic, but you weren't being mean. You were being honest and saying what needs to be said. Ashton, however, needed to have worded things a little bit differently. He was actually being mean. And then it's like, once she kind of understood why he was acting the way he was acting, she was like instantly not angry at him and like forgave him. And it was just like, no. Like, It is possible to understand why somebody's behaving the way they are. It's possible to even think that you would do the same thing in their shoes, and also still be really angry with them. So that didn't quite work out for me. But overall, I think that this was an excellent read, and I did end up giving this 4.25 stars. After that, I attempted to read Ink and Bone by Rachel Caine. This is a young adult alternate history, maybe mixed with some other genres, but essentially it posits that the Library of Alexandria never burned. And so it becomes like the forefront organization that's kind of controlling information, I guess, and books are, because books are banned. And so enter our main character of Jess, and Jess is part of a family that is a bunch of black market book smugglers, and they get him into the Library of Alexandria, like training program kind of thing, with the intent that he survives training and becomes a member of the library to be their inside man. And the story goes from there. And I really struggled with this, and I actually ended up DNFing it at page 48. So first and foremost, in the beginning chapters, it is like Jess when he's 10 years old, and there was physical abuse against the minor, content warning, which I just generally did not appreciate. It's something that I kind of struggle with in general, even when it's considered appropriate for the time period that a book is set in. But this, I just did not appreciate it at all. And then there was this really weird mix of genres. So obviously it's alternate history, but it's also set in 2025, so it's like near future science fiction. And then there's stuff that's happening that might be magic. I don't know. We're not given an explanation, but if it is magic, then it's fantasy. But it might also be super advanced technology. So then we're back into science fiction. But that would be weird because there's also a lot of steam powered technology. Like there's steam powered carriages still. So maybe not science fiction, but also maybe steampunk. It was too much. Like the fact that I can't tell you what genre it is a problem. And honestly, all of those genre mechanics kind of like rubbed up against each other in ways that made it feel very wrong. It just did not work together. And so I did not like that part either. I found the main character of Jess to be incredibly bland. And like it seemed like maybe the library was going to end up being a stand-in for the Catholic Church, and I was just like, I'm just not into this. Like I am just not into it. So I ended up DNFing it. After that, I picked up The Empire of Dreams by Ray Carson, the fourth book in the Girl of Fire and Thorn series. So in this one, we are following our main character of Red Sparkle Stone, and she is all set to be adopted by the Empress when it is blocked at court. And after that happens, Red decides that she is going to train to become a royal guard. And after she starts training, it becomes apparent very quickly that there is a plot against the royal family, her family. And so she needs to figure out what's going on and put a stop to it before any permanent damage happens. And the story goes from there. And I really, really enjoyed this. And I've actually, like, even since I originally rated this, I've realized I liked it a lot more than I thought I did. And part of it is because, like, it was just generally, this is a much quieter kind of book than the first one. So for like the world building, for instance, there's not an overwhelming amount of world building because we did so much in the original trilogy. But what we get is very interesting because instead of being from the perspective of the royal family, like we got with Elisa in the original trilogy, Redis has the perspective of sort of on the outside of the royal family, but also she's training to be a royal guard. So she's kind of like a servant of sorts. It's complicated. But that different perspective gives us interesting aspects to the world building. It just kind of changes the perspective enough to make things very, very interesting. Red herself is a great character. She is just very quietly kind of strong. She's a character that we meet in the original trilogy, and she's somebody we don't know a ton about. We don't know her history, partially because she doesn't seem to really know her history. And this book kind of rectifies that. We do have alternating chapters, like present day with Red's past, and we dive into that. Now, it is fairly traumatic because Red used to be a slave, and so all kinds of content warnings for that. I will say there is physical violence against Red on page. However, it doesn't get super graphic. It does do the fade to black kind of thing. Um, so we're diving into the past, which I do think adds a lot of depth to Red as a character, but also with that, um, Red has PTSD and it's very apparent in the present day. But one thing that I really like is that it's allowed to quietly exist as part of who she is. There's just not a ton of fanfare. It's like, and it's almost that much sadder because it's very clear that she's been given all these coping mechanisms to deal with, as much as she can, and it's still a trial. And so but she's accepted it, and it's very interesting how it is dealt with. It's also very realistic, partially because in the author's note, Ray Carson mentions that she herself has PTSD and she modeled Red's after her own. And it definitely does ring true. I think that probably the weakest part of this is actually the storyline, and it's just because it's fairly typical. It's not bad, it's just, again, typical. It feels a lot more like other YAs, which is, I mean, like the original trilogy, I think, did a really good job with the storylines, so it was a little sad to see this one be not quite as strong. But I still liked it. And honestly, one of the scenes that we got at the very end with the big reveal of what's happening and why was so good, as Rosario, who is the prince, addresses the person after the reasons why were revealed. And it was just like that still is sticking with me. So I think that was very, very well done. And then there's another thing that I love that I just wanted to mention, and it's like, again, it's just kind of another quiet moment that's allowed to exist. And it's essentially that Red and the other guards decide to do their own additional practice together. And as they're going around the group, they're saying, they're talking about who is good at what that can help. So it's like, Red is good at unarmed defense, and this guy's good at shield work, and this guy's good at sword work. And they come around to one of the people, and he's not good at any of the physical stuff. And so he's like, what am I good at? And they're like, very sincerely, they're like, you're the best cheerleader. And he takes that job so seriously, and it's never played for laughs. It's just an acknowledgement that sometimes in a group, there is somebody who's maybe not the best at what you're learning, but they're so encouraging that they make all the difference in the world. And so for me, that I really appreciated that scene as well. And then one last thing to mention is that there is no romance in this. It's a YA without a romance, and I loved that so much. So I ended up really, really enjoying this book, and I ended up giving it originally 4.25 stars, but the more I think about it, the more I'm likely to bump that up to 4.5. After that, I went ahead and gave a try to Mechanica by Betsy Cornwell. And this is a young adult fantasy retelling of Cinderella. Essentially, we're following our main character of Nicolette, and her mom was an inventor. And of course, her parents died, and she's a servant to the steps. But on her 16th birthday, she discovers her mom's inventor's workshop, and she thinks that this might be her ticket to, get away from her steps. I ended up DNFing this around page 38. So first off, this book just started in the wrong spot. We jumped into the action, but then almost immediately had to pull back to explain all kinds of things, which can be done okay, but it just honestly didn't work. It felt very middle grade. It was such a young adult that it felt middle grade, which is not my particular cup of tea. I don't think it was kind of odd how, like, what was decided to have explanations for and what was not explained. So, like, there were some things that I wanted more of an explanation for, and some things that I just didn't care, and I got a lot of explanation for. So I don't think that worked either. But like, and then it's a mix of science and magic, which I think can work just fine, but I don't think that the author got the mix particularly correct in this one, especially when you're doing like a mix of science and magic. You can't just be like, it works because magic. Like, you, even if the character doesn't know, that's fine, but you have to approach the explanation a little bit differently and be like, I don't know yet, or like any number of things, not just like, it works because magic. Maybe that's a personal pet peeve, but um, and so a lot of these, it was so many iffy things way too early in the book, so I just went ahead and DNF'd it. After that, I read Archie Volume 1 by Mark Waid, and this is, and it's illustrated by Fiona Staples. But this is a modernization of the old Archie comics. If you're unfamiliar with the old Archie comics, it basically follows this kid, Archie Andrews. He's fairly popular at school. His best friend, Jughead, and his other two friends, Betty and Veronica, who are by turns friends with each other and sometimes competing with each other for Archie's affections. And it's a whole bunch of high school hijinks. Now, so this is a modernization of this. And one of the things that I think was done really, really well is like, it feels like the people who worked on this actually appreciated the Archie comics and knew what worked about them. So like, if you read the Archie comics, there's still a lot of stuff that actually works. It's just so outdated. And so like, they kept the stuff that works while like updating all of the stuff that's just definitely dated. And I think that they did a really, really good job. As for the characters, I love Jughead. Jughead is incredibly smart. He or wise, I guess is the correct thing. He's wise and tends to be wise in all of the comics. I like Betty. Hate Veronica, which is very typical. Veronica is that rich person who's moved to the like what she would consider the Hicks, right? A smaller town that just doesn't have the same amenities that she's used to, and she has trouble adjusting, and she takes it out on everybody else. The big thing there were two major issues that I had. The storyline is pretty good. However, it ended in a way that I don't like when comics end that way. Basically, it felt more like a scene ending rather than a chapter ending. So I'm like it just didn't feel like an end. And I just don't love that approach to comics. So again, that may be personal preference. But the other thing is that the big conflict that has happened between Betty and Archie, like, it's so teenager, you guys. Like, it's one of those things where they had this fight, and like both Betty and Archie have legitimate points, but also aren't completely correct. And instead of working it out together, they just walk away. And I'm like, you guys need to communicate better. Like, I never feel so old as when I see this kind of stuff between teenagers. And so, like, I don't love it, but it is appropriate for the comic, so it was fine, I guess. But I still generally really enjoyed this, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. After that, I finished Of Wars and Memories and Starlight by Aliette de Bodard. This is a short story collection, and most of the short stories are set in the Shuya universe. Now, in this universe, it posits this very interesting scenario where the Western Europeans were not the first people to discover America, but it was actually the Chinese. And so how would the world look different? But this is set in all the Shuya universe stories are set in pretty well into the far future. And so things are very different, but it has a foundation that is so different than our world. Most of the stories are set not with like the Chinese culture element, but actually with the Vietnamese culture element, which means that the themes of the stories are slightly different, which we'll get into. Um, Mostly, okay, so honestly, it's like there's a lot of war and colonialism and death and grief in this, and how do you deal with all of these things? And I do think that even though those are hard topics to deal with, a lot of the stories dealt with them in very interesting and profound kind of ways. The quality of these short stories are honestly just so high. Like you can tell because in the there's author notes at the back that just, the Aliette de Bodard gives a little bit of background information on each short story and says whether if the stories were nominated for awards, if they won awards, and the vast majority are at the very least nominated for awards. And you can just tell, like, these stories are just generally very good. I personally loved the short stories Immersion, Memorials, and The Waiting Stars, as I thought that they twisted my expectations in very interesting ways. And really what I want is a full-length novel from the Shiyu universe, and I don't think there is any slated, and I'm going to hold out hope over here. But I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. Highly recommend if you are into science fiction short stories. And then the very last thing for May is I tried to read Against the Dark by Carolyn Caine. And this is an adult contemporary romance, and we are following our main character of Angel, who used to be part of a girl gang of jewel thieves. She was the safecracker. She got out, she went straight until one of the aunts, an aunt of one of the girls is kidnapped, but it's like the aunt that took care of them all. So Angel's like, okay, one last job. We'll insert Cole, who is a security guard at the target's house, only he's undercover trying to find evidence of some serious wrongdoing, and he catches on to Angel and decides to blackmail her into fake dating to also help him crack the safe where the information is that he needs. And the story goes from there. I really tried with this, but I ended up DNFing it at page 56. And the biggest problem is that there's a whole lot of telling and not showing. And so, and that doesn't really work for romance, especially when you're talking about the emotional part of romance, which we were. There was this scene, there was a part of the opening scene that was supposed to be hot between Angel and Cole, and it fell completely flat. There was just honestly nothing there. And then just as another small irritant on the side, Cole is apparently really smart and does a lot of math things. He's a math whiz, which I also have issues with his background, but we're not going to get into that because less relevant. But he's a math whiz, and he's how the author writes it is basically him being I have these magical equations and I can plug information into the variables and tell you whether crime's being done. And I'm but I know it's just the math person in me, but I'm also that's not how that works. Math equations can definitely tell you when there's interesting things happening with the data, but it still needs interpretation from a person. Anyway, it's fine. We're all fine. So I have issues with the characterization as well. So I ended up just DNFing it. But that is it, everybody. Those are all the things that I read or attempted to read in the last 2 weeks of May. Let me know down below if you have any thoughts or feelings about any of them. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know all the things. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.